Namaste and welcome to the 10 p.m. Wednesday show, which today is 10:30. Well, due to, should I say, quote unquote, unforeseen situations. Well, never mind. And we've got David Wood with us now. And of course, Vibhuti Jha, as usual, Wednesday 10 p.m. Welcome, David.
Hi, how's it going?
Good.
And we have a very simple question to you.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you win jihad or win over jihad through appeasement?
Oh, it's pretty easy. Just give the jihadis everything they want, and then you'll be safe. Unless you join the wrong sect, in which case they're going to kill you anyway. So yeah. If you ask lots of Muslims, what everyone is supposed to do, it's supposed to be that we're all supposed to convert to Islam or pay the jizya and in theory, according to the Muslim sources, if we were to either convert to Islam or take second-class citizen status and pay jizya, although that's not open to everyone, that's officially open to Jews and Christians, although it has been applied to groups like Hindus and so on in the past. In theory, we're supposed to be okay as long as we pay our money on time. Then, like paying to the mafia, then we should be okay. But in practice, how it actually works is there was so much confusion about which sect is the true sect in Islam after Muhammad's death, because he didn't leave any clear successor, and so they started fighting over it. That it wouldn't matter what you did. You could submit and pay the jizya, and it would be you're paying to the wrong group or this or that, and so it would be similar to the mafia. It would be like, oh, you're paying this family of the mafia and not our family of the mafia, and so you still have to be fought. And it's just not gonna win through appeasement here.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting because we see that in Afghanistan right now with the people who are going with the Taliban are getting killed by the IS Khorasan province, ISKP. And I don't know. What sect is Ilhan Omar, by the way?
She's Somali, so she would be Sunni, but she's her own thing. She's combined with Western far left political ideology. And I don't know if you saw it, but she recently got booed on stage by Somalis when she showed up to a Somali event, and they booed her because she's gone too far for them. And so
that means she's violated the Sharia law, is it?
No, sorry, go ahead, David. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no question. And it's finally it's for a long time you could have alliances between Muslim activists and various political alliances and so on, but now you're starting to see that split as lots of Muslims are realizing, wait a minute, these politicians that we've put forward to champion our goals are actually working against us now by going too far away from what we want from our families and so on. And so, yeah, she's seems like she's going to be kind of off on her own because if her own community is turning their backs on her, then
What exactly she did on the stage, it was a musical show. A Somali singer was performing, and apparently when she came on the stage to welcome or give her speech, she started ranting against America and told that the plight of Somalians is horrible. And the crowd didn't like that at all.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I didn't know that's what led to the booing.
That's what led to that. She began to berate America. They began to talk that America is bad and Somalian conditions are so terrible in America. And that's the time when the crowd turned around to say that you are giving us a bad name. We are pretty cool and happy here. So that is what led to her ejection. And hopefully there is another guy contesting against her who is not a Somalian, but he's a Muslim guy. He's an elderly person. And they are expecting tough time for her, although she has a very guaranteed vote bank, in that region. But be that as it may, I wanted to ask you a very specific question, because people of our clan who are able to openly and ask a question, we are immediately blamed as Islamophobic. We are immediately blamed as causing blasphemy. And that straightway, in my humble opinion, conflicts with the freedom of speech. That's why the appeasement, this question is very important. So are we going to deal with Islamophobia or blasphemy by curbing, curtailing, and snapping away of freedom of speech to even inquire?
Yeah, that's the rough part there, because I mean, think about it. You've got an ideology which calls for the violent subjugation of the entire world. It calls Jews, Christians, any other non-Islamic group. The Quran specifically calls us, Surah 98, verse 6 of the Quran, calls us the worst of creatures. So we're lower than insects, according to Islam, because we reject Muhammad. And the Muslim sources call for the violent subjugation of the entire world. This proceeds in stages when Muslims, and the pattern goes back to the life of Muhammad and to the Muslim sources. But when Muhammad is the persecuted prophet in Mecca who's completely outnumbered, and the polytheists of Mecca are making fun of him and so on, then his message was, hey, God's going to judge in the afterlife, but in this life, let's not fight each other. That message changed when Muhammad fled Mecca and went to Medina, and he was able to form alliances. That's when he started robbing the caravans and so on. And he started preaching a message of defensive jihad, that if someone is attacking you or even making fun of your religion, then you can go out and fight them. And lots of Muslims will point to passages about defensive jihad and say, you see, jihad is just self-defense. But later, once Muhammad had the most powerful force in Arabia, then the message changed again to one of offensive jihad. So now it's upon us to go out and violently subjugate the entire world. So the commands that are directed towards Muslims change depending on their status in society. So if you have a place like the United States where Muslims make up around 1% of the population, they're supposed to do what Muhammad did when he was completely outnumbered, which is, God will judge eventually, but, let's not persecute each other, because that's what's in the best interest of the Muslim community when they're only a tiny minority of the population. If the situation changes and Muslims make up 10 or 15% of the population, or even a majority in a certain area, then they're supposed to be fighting, waging defensive jihad, which means any sort of criticism, any sort of questioning of their ideology, they can retaliate with physical violence. Even if they're not able to subjugate a population, they're supposed to fight defensively as a warning not to criticize or challenge their community. And if in a situation where they become uppermost, where they become the most powerful group, then everyone else has to be subjugated and has to be second-class citizens. And what's amazing is you can look around at the world today. You can pick any country, and you don't have to tell me which country it is. You could just tell me what's the percentage of Muslims in the population. And I can tell you what the message of Islam is going to be, because this has been their playbook for 14 centuries. And so what's amazing is you have an ideology that for 14 centuries has been coming after all of us. The only time it ever stops is when someone physically stops it from advancing. And yet, even though we are all targets, I'm a target, you guys are targets, even though the commands that are directed towards the jihadis, what they're supposed to do in certain situations, in various situations, is if they're not yet strong enough to fight us, they're supposed to focus on building up the ummah, building up the community of Muslims, strengthening themselves for the day when they actually can go door to door, knocking on the door and say, hey, you have to convert, or you have to pay us the jizya, or you have to be executed. And you would think that since our lives are on the line, and since the subjugation of our families is on the line, that we would at least be allowed to say something in response, that we would at least be allowed to object and say, no, actually, we don't want you to violently subjugate us, and we challenge this ideology. We challenge this prophet that commands you to do these things. You'd think we'd be allowed to do that, especially in a place like the United States, or countries that claim to have a very high view of freedom of speech. And yet, if you say, wait a minute, I don't believe that I'm one of the worst of creatures. I don't believe that this guy is a true prophet. Somehow you're a racist, Islamophobic, hate-mongering bigot. And the real reason behind that is this always happens, that in Islam, they're supposed to get whatever implemented that they can get implemented. So you can't implement full Sharia in a place like the United States, or most of India, or in most places in the world. You can't implement any sort of full-blown Sharia. And so it's a matter of how much can you get in given what's at your disposal. And so you can't go around violently subjugating people in the US. Your community isn't strong enough. And so what you do is you come up with other ways of getting the same result. Notice, if we're in Pakistan, then you just can't say anything. You just can't say anything, because if you do, a mob will form and they'll beat you to death, as has happened many times. But in the US, where you can't just form a mob and beat everyone to death for criticizing Muhammad or criticizing Islam, you have to come up with other ways to reach the same goal. And the way you reach the goal over here is you claim to be a poor victim of other people, and they're criticizing you because they're racists. Even if what you're criticizing is, hey, I don't like jihad, I don't like terrorism, I don't like these things, and these things should stop. Even if you're saying something that everyone would agree on, as long as you claim that people are doing it out of racism, that's just become a thing nowadays. That's an easy way to win an argument for them. But notice, the goal is always the same. The goal, whether it's Pakistan or the US or Europe or India, the goal is always to silence all criticism of Islam. And we just have to be strong-minded and say, no, we're not stopping.
Well, in Pakistan, they even burned down the QR code. So,
Yeah, anything.
Yeah, what's that about QR codes? I mean, I didn't follow that pretty well.
Apparently, there was a Samsung QR code, and they said there were elements of blasphemy in it. So they began to
how can there be elements of blasphemy in the QR code?
Sanjay ji, you are asking a question, how can there be? There is no need for how. They just wanted to do it. They did it.
Oh, it's exactly like blaming Nupur Sharma for quoting a hadith, is it?
That's right. You are right. Sorry.
David, I just would like to ask you, from your study of the Islamic scriptures, is it permitted for a non-Muslim to read, study, and quote from the Islamic scriptures?
No, in fact, under Sharia, non-Muslims aren't even allowed to. We're not allowed to teach the Quran. In the Pact of Umar, it was this. These were the dhimmi obligations that if you wanted dhimmi status, so if you agreed to become a second-class citizen in order to not be violently subjugated, you had to agree to all of these terms. And the Christians were required to agree that they would not teach the Quran to their children. Now, you'd think, well, hey, if Islam is the truth and the Quran is the perfect word of Allah, then why wouldn't Christians be allowed to read the Quran, to teach the Quran to their children? And what you find is there's just too much concern that we're going to be critical of it, and that we're kind of reading their playbook, right? If they've got their playbook, here's how we're going to violently subjugate the world, which is basically what the Quran is. It's a manual for subjugating the world. They didn't want Christians to be able to teach this, to learn what's going on, and to be able to share what's going on. So in order to pay the jizya, and accept second-class citizenship in exchange for not being killed, you had to agree, we're not going to be teaching anything about what's in the Muslim sources. And so you can, I mean, that would be weird, right? It would never enter into a Christian's mind, hey, we don't want Muslims to read the Bible or to have access to the Bible or to be learning the Bible. It wouldn't enter our mind. Well, of course, we'd love for you guys to read the Bible. But in Islam, it's no, you guys, if you're not, until you're ready to convert, you stay away from this book. And so, so one, that goes all the way back. That goes all the way back. But two, then there's this element of, if you're saying something that's at all critical, now you're entering into the realm of blasphemy, according to them. So if you're questioning Muhammad or criticizing Muhammad, then yeah, they're gonna find a way to silence you. And in the case of Nupur Sharma, they knew that if they complained loud enough, they could get, a bunch of Muslim countries involved and could get her silenced that way.
Yes, it was quite strange because she was only quoting something that is being taught very widely, in fact, and very proudly also.
Oh yeah,
But,
once
it was
all
said by Nupur,
all over their sources.
Yes.
Yeah, it's all over their sources. You can't. I mean, you could go Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Sunan Abu Dawud, over and over and over again. You read about Muhammad marrying a young girl, having sex with her when she's 9 years old. That's everywhere. Even though there are Muslims who want to deny it because they're ashamed. Many of them are ashamed of what their prophet did, because their prophet, the perfect moral example, when he's more than 50 years old, had sex with a prepubescent 9-year-old girl. And a lot of Muslims are ashamed about that, so they don't want people to know about it. But it's all over their sources. And their greatest, most respected Quran commentator of all time, Ibn Kathir, when he spoke on this issue, he said, there is no dispute among Muslim scholars on the age of Aisha. And so it's something that's considered indisputable by scholars. It's even in the Quran, Surah 65, verse 4, Muslims are told how to divorce prepubescent girls before they marry another man. And so it's indisputable that this is allowed in Islam, and that the greatest moral example of all time, Muhammad, did this. And yet, if you mention it and you're not praising it, if you're saying, hey, there could be a problem here, then they have to silence you. But notice it's the same thing again, right? Whether it's the United States, whether it's India, whether it's Pakistan, they'll do it. They'll go about reaching the goal in different ways, but the goal is always the same. No one's allowed to criticize Islam.
So how do you tackle it?
Oh, he's muted. You're talking, but you're muted.
No,
there you
can
go.
you hear me?
Yeah.
No, yeah.
I was saying, so I was muted. So Sanjay ji, go ahead. You ask your question.
Yes. I was asking a question. How do you tackle it? Because in the United States, where the population is just about 1%, even here, they have found a way to silence criticism. And even here, they have found a way to get over the freedom of speech by talking about Islamophobia, by playing victim. So how do you tackle this situation? Or just as you say that, okay, just succumb.
Yeah, well, if you notice, it's all the institutions that have power over communication. They're all on the same side of this, right? So whether it's politicians or journalists, especially journalists are the absolute worst. The entire education system, so college professors and so on, Hollywood, everyone's on the same page that if you criticize Islam, you're the one with the problem. You're the one who has a problem, and it's probably racism. But everyone in positions of authority over what other people, over communication, over what people are allowed to say, the tech companies, so Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, they're all on the same page here, in that they're all trying to silence criticism of Islam one way or another, or at least to reduce it. And that's what we're up against. And that may seem like things are just hopeless, because how can we, look, we're like YouTubers and podcasters and things like that. How can we stand up when everyone up there in any position of power is against us? But it's what we have on our side. We have the truth on our side, and we have a lot of common sense on our side, so that if you watch someone change their mind, because a person can change his mind about something and say, oh, I was wrong about that. When people change their minds about something, they're usually changing their minds in our favor. So it's normally, oh, I had heard that Islam is a religion of peace, but now that you're showing me what the Muslim sources say, yeah, this is a problem. Or yes, I had a friend who told me that Muhammad never had sex with a young girl, but now that I'm looking at the sources, yes, he obviously did. And so what we have on our side, we have the truth. Because when we're talking about what's in the Muslim sources, that's factual information. We can actually point to it and show, here's what the Muslim sources say. Here's how jihad works in Islam. When you make up a tiny percentage of the population, you try to live in peace and build up your community. When you're stronger, but you're not yet able to subjugate a community, then you fight defensively to make sure that they're not challenging or criticizing you. And then if you become the most powerful force, then you violently subjugate everyone around you. That's in the Quran. That's in the Hadith. There are Muslim scholars today who will say, when they're being honest, will say the exact same thing. There's a recent clip by Sheikh Asim al-Hakim, where he's saying exactly what we say about jihad and how it proceeds in stages. And he's telling Muslims openly on YouTube to prepare now, since they're not strong enough to subjugate the entire world. He's telling them to prepare now, and saying that 50 years from now, when they're strong enough, then they can go door to door, and it's convert, pay the jizya, or this is what he said. He goes, you convert, you pay the jizya, or so he's talking about mass murder. He's totally fine on YouTube, because he's on the right side of that issue according to the YouTube censors. But that's all stuff we can point out in their sources. We can show 14 centuries of Islamic history. And you guys know Robert has a book, The History of Jihad. The history of jihad shows jihad hasn't stopped. Most people, especially in places like the United States, aren't familiar with anything before like 9/11. But if you actually study the history of jihad, it has never stopped since the time of Muhammad, when he actually started fighting. It has been relentless in coming after us for 14 centuries. And so when we say, hey, here's what Islam is and here's what it teaches, you can have people say, you're racist, you're bigots, you're Islamophobes, but we have the truth on our side. And so that's something that we can use to show other people that they do need to be concerned about this, that this has nothing to do with race. I have to say that you guys have a huge advantage here. And this is why it's awesome that you guys are talking about this, because people see me in the US, and if I'm criticizing Islam, it's very easy to say, this guy's a racist or something like that. They've been trained to do that. But it's harder to say that about you guys, right? Because you obviously you obviously don't hate you obviously don't hate brown-skinned people, and so they can't say it about you. And so it's good that you guys are exposing jihad.
In fact, it's the other way around. Over here, it's what is called the Ashraf community, the people who have come from Iran and Turkey, Central Asia, and Arabia. They actually flaunt their pedigree and look down upon the converts. So we have this little thing about the Ashraf, that we do target Ashraf in particular. And we say the Pasmanda, the backwards, or the converts, what we call the locals, the local Muslims. So instead of local Muslims, we try and concentrate and focus on the racism that is inherent among the Ashraf, that is the foreign elite among the Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
That we do. We do that quite regularly.
And that's been the same thing in other places as well. That it's been complained. Muslims in the Muslim Students Association in the U.S. have complained that Black Muslims are treated as lower than Arab Muslims, even in the Muslim Students Association. So this is the major Muslim students group in the U.S., and they're complaining that the Arab Muslims look down on the African American Muslims.
Yeah, they were the slaves once upon a time. So that's that.
Yes. So slavery is actually the first practice of slavery is found among the Muslims only. I think all the black slave trade that happened, who were the Christians who were bringing it to US? Who were they getting it from? They were getting it all from the Muslims only. Well, that is all there on record.
Yeah, and you, long before the United States even existed, you had the slave trade over there. Muhammad's the one who institutionalized a race-based slavery in Africa. That's the one because keep in mind, almost everyone down through history had slaves. But if you look at in the Roman Empire or something like that, slavery wasn't race-based, right? It was you could have a Greek slave or something like that, but the slave would look exactly the same as everyone else. You had just been enslaved at some point. But with Muhammad, Muhammad bought, owned, sold, and traded Black African slaves. You could have slaves of other kinds, but the slave trade in Islam became a sort of thing where you go to Africa and that's where you get your slaves from. And it was actually horrible. Slaves were so cheap, they would castrate the male slaves to make sure that they didn't have to worry about them around the women. And but notice this is not something where you can say, hey, there were people who wrongly enslaved other people, because I can say that from a Christian background, shouldn't have been doing that. But when the greatest moral example in your religion, Muhammad, bought, owned, sold, and traded Black African slaves, it's kind of difficult to come along later and say that it's evil and wrong.
Right. Of course, India is one example which never had slavery, but slaves were taken from here and taken to Central Asia and to Afghanistan and traded. That happened when the Central Asians first came here. Even the Arabs, when they first came here, because the Arabs, of course, were chased away. They didn't stay there long enough. But then when the Central Asians, the Turks, they came, they created havoc. Of course, that's a separate story. Vibhuti Ji, you had a few questions to ask.
Yeah, my question is that knowing what we know now, now we are able to read, we are able to configure, we are able to question, and we are able to convey to the people what the entire text talks about, including whether it is Salafi jihadism, whether it is apostasy, and everything else we know now. Is that the reason why they prohibit and punish us as an individual? Because that's their tool. Violence, subjugation, that is their tool of negotiation. Everything they indulge in extreme violence. In one of the states in India, 4 guys breached a dam and caused a massive flood. Who thinks like that? This is the kind of a vitiated mind. And it's for people like us to expose the truth of the text that they are, and only the muftis and the mullahs talk about it. They give their own interpretation to that. So question here is, how do we contest that?
Earns them reward points, 9.120 Quran.
Yeah, it's already happening. We're already doing it, right? If you go back just 14 or 15 years ago, I know because that's when I started talking. That's when I was starting to talk about these things more publicly and go around speaking and so on. But if you just go back 13, 14, 15 years, when you said that Muhammad had sex with a 9-year-old girl, no one believed you. There's no way the founder of this great religion did anything like that. When you talked about jihad, it was, no, this is something that a tiny minority of extremists believe. If you said that Islam has a death penalty for apostasy and that if you leave Islam, the penalty is death, No. That's just an extremist interpretation. Now, these things have become much more commonly known by regular people. And so now you have Muslims admitting these things, even on YouTube, admitting these things regularly. You have people like Ali Dawa saying that he's proud of Islamic death penalties for leaving Islam. You have them admitting that Aisha was 9 years old when Muhammad had sex with her. So they're admitting all the things that they were denying 15 years ago because they could back then, and because it was in their best interest to deny these things and lie about them 15 years ago. Now, because of what we've been doing in exposing the texts of their religion and the history of their religion, now they have to acknowledge these things. So the way things are heading is people are learning more and more about Islam, and they're not liking what they're finding. And they're finding out that no, the people who 15 years ago were called liars and Islamophobes were absolutely correct. And now even Muslims are admitting that we were absolutely correct back then. But I mean, notice the in a way, this jihad is kind of brilliant in its strategy of calling for the violent subjugation of the world, but making sure no one is allowed to talk about it. You have to be quiet about it. It's a brilliant strategy. It's, hey, we've got our playbook. It's right here. It says exactly what we're going to do. It says exactly what we're going to do to you, what we can do to your wife, what we can do to your family. It says exactly what our plans are. And you're not allowed to talk about it. And you would think, if you were thinking that the world is at all sane, that if there's an ideology calling for your violent subjugation, you're going to be allowed to expose it and talk about it. And everyone, you would think that everyone, that politicians and educators and entertainers and journalists, that everyone's going to agree, wait a minute, here's this ideology. It's calling for all of us to be subjugated. We have to expose this. But it's brilliant. Jihad is brilliant in the way that it actually silences people who could expose it. But it's just starting to break down with the internet and people being allowed to show what the Muslim sources say. The strategy is breaking down. But notice when I talked about, all these institutions of power over communication, they're all on the same page. That's because they were the targets, right? It's, if you allow, you journalists, if you CNN allow any sort of criticism against Islam, it's like you're trying to get us Muslims killed, and you're bigots and you're racists. And, the journalists just go along with that. And so the goal was actually really, really smart. If we can just, talking from the perspective of jihadis, if we can just get all of the institutions of power to agree that criticism of Islam is evil and must not be allowed, then we can continue advancing our plans and no one's going to challenge it. Didn't work. It's not working out for them. It's not working out for them because now we have the ability to go around exposing them. And so silencing journalists isn't enough anymore. It's just amazing that we're winning. I mean, Islam is starting to crumble from within because so much information is now available to expose it. And it's sort of crumbling from within now. And that's in spite of all this effort to silence all critics of Islam. It's not working for them anymore.
You think internet will be the last nail?
That's that was actually one of the first articles I ever wrote on Islam. So before I was ever on YouTube, I was writing articles for a website called Answering Islam. And one of the earliest articles I wrote was called Islam Beheaded, the Information Superhighway and the Death of Mohammedanism. And the idea was that for 14 centuries of Islam, Muslim leaders have been able to keep their people insulated from hearing any criticism of Islam and from hearing any serious presentation of an alternative to Islam. So in other words, if you grew up in Saudi Arabia, you're going to be exposed only to Islam, you're not going to be exposed to the problems with what you're saying. You're not going to be exposed to criticisms of Muhammad and the Quran. You're not going to hear any of that. And you're not going to hear any serious presentation of any alternative to Islam. You're just going to hear Islam. And so the goal of Muslim leaders was to keep their people completely insulated. And that worked for 14 centuries. And then something started changing in the 20th century, started getting far greater numbers of Muslims coming to other countries where they would be exposed to critical information about Muhammad and the Quran. But then you had the internet, where all of a sudden critics of Islam have open access to Muslims around the world. Any Muslim with an internet connection, you can now reach that Muslim on the internet. And so their leaders are no longer in a position to keep them insulated from hearing these criticisms. And interestingly, at the same time that's happening, we also all get open access to their sources. So now anyone can open up multiple translations of the Quran. Anyone can open up Sahih al-Bukhari. Anyone can open up Sahih Muslim. Anyone can open up the history of At-Tabari. Anyone can have access to these books now. Whereas in the past, and so you can think about this, here in the US, there was a time in the 1960s when Islam spread very rapidly in the African American community, because Muslim preachers were coming in and saying, yeah, you see what Christianity has done with slavery. Come to Islam, where everyone is equal and all races are equal, and Muhammad abolished slavery, and all. It's complete nonsense, right? But notice, no one had their sources. No one had Sahih al-Bukhari. No one had Sahih Muslim. Most people didn't even have access to a Quran. So this allowed Muslim preachers to preach whatever they wanted, and no one was in a position to expose their lies, because people didn't have their sources. And that's what happened for several decades here in the US. When Muslim preachers would go to an area, they would just look at whatever the people in the area like, and whatever the people like, they would say that's what Islam teaches, and no one knew any better. So they would say, hey, oh, you like women's rights here? Well, did you know that Muhammad was a champion of women's rights, and he's basically the greatest feminist who ever lived? They would say that sort of thing. If they're in an area where they're talking to educated people with a respect for science, did you know the Quran is this scientific miracle, and that it's filled with all of these scientific claims that couldn't possibly have been known during the time of Muhammad? How else could this have happened unless it's from God? Whatever people liked, people wanted a religion of peace. Islam became the religion of peace. It didn't matter what people liked. Muslim preachers would say that's what Islam teaches, and no one was in a position to expose them and raise their hand and say, wait a minute, you say Islam's about women's rights. What about this and this and this and this and this and this and this? No one was able to do that. Right now, what the internet has done is now we have open access to their sources, and we have the ability to speak to Muslims in our areas where we're still allowed to speak, and even Muslims who are in places like Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, any of these places where if you were there and you said these things, you'd be killed. We can communicate with Muslims through the internet. And so it's already crumbling. It's already started. And that's why you have Muslims complaining about this avalanche of apostasy. That's not my words. They're the ones who, they call it an avalanche of apostasy. They're calling it a tsunami of apostasy. The statistics from just a few years ago was that 24% of Muslim youth are leaving Islam. So a quarter of Muslim youth, and this is years ago. So this is actually going to be worse for them right now. But you're talking about a quarter of young Muslims are just leaving Islam. And so it's crumbling, and people are catching on, and it's just they're in trouble. It's not gonna work out for them. So they had all these methods of silencing critics and killing cartoonists and so on, and they can't deal with the internet, because the entire strategy was silence all critics of Islam, and they can't do that anymore.
And it is even if they can do it, because that's the only tool available to them. They resort to violence, silence individual voices, as a result of which others don't talk. And so that's the way to do it. And I was I made a note here that you alluded to that in a moment ago, that jihad and Islam is fighting an existential threat because people now know what they are up to. But the question arises is that, will there be ever a proper assimilation? And if they are walking away from that faith, if 25% people have begun to walk away, where do they end up? What do they end up as? Because that's a very volatile group again, because they have had to leave their roots because of its whatever it says. But where do they join? What do they become? Because that's another volatile group to talk about, because you do not want them to be returning with greater violence in their minds.
Yeah, well, one of the positive things about so many people leaving Islam is that now you have a pretty large community of ex-Muslims, and they're sort of they're banding together as ex-Muslims. And why that's important is, again, for people who haven't been watching what's been happening for very long, this is it's an incredibly different environment than it was just 15 years ago. 15 years ago when my friend Nabil left Islam, this was, I think, no, it's actually 17 years ago. But when Nabil left Islam, it was rare. It was still very rare to hear from someone who was an ex-Muslim. There were a few ex-Muslims who acknowledged that they were ex-Muslims, but it was rare to see someone openly admitting to be an ex-Muslim, because you become a target. You become a target for an attack. And so very rare back then. There were ex-Muslims, but most of them would be very quiet about it. And only a few publicly admitting it. Whereas now they're just everywhere. They're all over the place. They're having conferences and things like that. And there are, tons of them on YouTube. And so in a very, very short amount of time, you've gone from almost no one to the point where 15 years ago, it was still very common when someone said that they were an ex-Muslim. It was still very common for Muslims to deny that anyone has ever left Islam. I mean, they would say, no one's ever left Islam. You're a liar. If you've converted to Christianity, you were always a Christian. You're just pretending that you were an ex-Muslim to get money from Jews or something like that. They always come up with these conspiracy theories, but they always wanted to maintain that no one leaves Islam, that anyone who says they're an ex-Muslim is lying. Whereas now you can't deny it, because there were people who were going around for years preaching Islam and were Muslim debaters who then left Islam. And so they were publicly prominent as Muslims before leaving Islam. And so Abdullah Samir, who's an atheist, he was a very publicly active Muslim before he left Islam. Farhan Qureshi, I had probably 5 or 6 public debates with Farhan when he was part of a group called the Muslim Debate Initiative. He left Islam. And so it's hard to deny that these guys were Muslims, but now it's everywhere. I mean, every time I go online, I'm seeing more ex-Muslims. So it looks like this is just getting started. And that's why it makes sense for Muslim leaders to be calling this an avalanche of apostasy. And an avalanche just starts with a little bit, and then it starts building until it looks like an entire mountain of snow is crashing down. And it's got to be terrifying for Muslim leaders who are watching this.
Well, I don't think we have enough stats on that, because I would think that in most of the Islamic countries, such people leaving Islam would still be hiding their identity. Don't you think?
Oh yeah, and it's been estimated. This is not coming from me. This is coming from Muslims. They're estimating that even in Muslim majority countries, that around 5% of the population are closet atheists. So they've actually become atheists, and they're just not announcing it because they don't want the penalties for leaving Islam. And so what you have is, you have an underground movement. You have people converting to Christianity or becoming atheists and so on. It's becoming very common for now, in places where they'll get killed, most people are lying low and being quiet about it. But I mean, once the numbers have increased to a certain degree, it's going to be impossible to stop them. I mean, it's easy to if you have one family who converts from Islam to something else, it's very easy to do something about that family. If you have millions of people, it's going to be hard to do something about that.
Yeah, I know there's a very active ex-Muslim group in India as well. And the way they are bringing light to the other Muslims is phenomenal. But I've also noticed a difference among the Muslims. Say, there are ex-Muslims from Pakistan and there are ex-Muslims from India, but their attitude towards others is very different. For instance, the ex-Muslims from Pakistan, they are soft on Christianity, but they are very, very virulent on Hinduism, for instance, even though they claim themselves to be atheists.
I've noticed that too. Like here in the U.S., when someone is an ex-Muslim, and someone leaves Islam and becomes an atheist or a Christian, you don't hear them. You usually don't hear one word about Hinduism. But yes, from the ex-Muslims who have a Pakistani or Indian background, it seems that a lot of them believe we have to be going after Hinduism just as much as we're going after.
Not from India.
Nobody.
Ex-Muslims from India don't do that.
Okay.
Ex-Muslims from Pakistan do that almost invariably.
Yeah, and so that's interesting. It's almost like it's been built into them all their lives that Hindus are the enemies, and then even after changing their religious beliefs, then they still keep that. It reminds me of, like, so there are Muslims who obviously do not like pork their entire lives, and yet they will convert to something else and they'll still hate pork, and it's because they've hated it all their lives. And so it can be similar, and not just in Pakistan, but really anywhere. You can grow up hating some other group. So you could have ex-Muslims who still don't like Jews because of what Islam teaches, and so they grow up all their lives very suspicious of Jews, and then even if they convert to something else, will still be suspicious of Jews. And so it is interesting how, depending on where you're from, this can it's still, you still carry this over with you even after your conversion. You're still carrying this baggage with you.
Good, right. That's very interesting. Vibhuti Ji, do you have something? Because
after
that, I plan to go to the questions.
Yeah, but one thing which I wanted to say that, although, Islam is getting more exposed, people are getting to know the truth, the reality, the harshness of it all. It's not going to disappear or vamoose in a short time. Are we entering an era of a genuine Cold War between jihadism and the rest of the world?
You're right in that.
It's quite hot here in India right now.
Yeah,
it's not cold at all.
Yeah, it's anytime you have Islam, which is like over a fifth of the world's population, it's not just going to go away, even as it's being exposed. But what I think we will see very soon is that Muslim nations are going to realize that what they're doing isn't working long term, right? So they can go after Nupur Sharma and get these temporary victories, but the long term it doesn't work, because notice, let's say Nupur Sharma, she says something about Muhammad and Aisha, and if they're able to get her silenced and marginalized, well, in the process of that, a lot of people just found out about Muhammad and Aisha, right? So they may have won a temporary victory. Ha, we silenced them, now we feel strong. But guess what? A lot of people just learned what Muhammad did, who didn't know it before. And so in the long term, you actually lost. You don't realize it yet. And that's what's happening. It's like with any terrorist attack, it's we got this terrorist attack and we took out these cartoonists here. well, okay, but now a bunch of people just learned more about Islam who are paying attention now, who weren't paying attention to it before. And so they keep doing these things where they get these very limited victories and it makes them feel strong. And I think it's hurting them in the long run. So no, I don't think we're just going to see Islam gone anytime soon.
Right.
But I think that in the very near future, so in the 5 to 10 year from now period, I think you're going to see more and more Islamic countries realizing that they can't execute people for blasphemy or for leaving Islam and so on, and I think they'll start to realize they can't even have these kinds of laws anymore because there are so many ex-Muslims. And so I think it's going to have to eventually in the near future become less violent than it has been. But we're right in that window where they're getting desperate, right? They're realizing they're having all these apostates leaving Islam, and they're wondering, they're scrambling to figure out what we do here. What do we do? What do we do to stop this? And they're still in that mode of we have to silence people. And so I think you're going to get a lot of violence right now as kind of their last ditch desperate attempt to silence people. It's like someone who's drowning, right? Someone goes in the water and they start realizing they're drowning. They start flipping out and swinging in every direction. And you can even try to save the person. The person will start attacking you because they're panicking because they're drowning. And I think that's what's happening with Islam right now is I think they're going to be very violent, but it's because they're panicking. So I would say to people, as you see Islam getting violent, realize that it's because they're panicking because of what's happening and how so many people are leaving Islam. Don't think it's because they're resurging because they're getting stronger or something like that. They're not. They're panicking because they know they're all the foundations upon which they've built their religion are crumbling, and so they're going to panic, and you're going to get a lot of violence. But I think that in the near future, they're going to have to realize this is actually backfiring on us, that flipping out over these things and getting violent and killing cartoonists is actually backfiring on us. And so we need to stop this stuff.
The desire to control things has been very intelligently done by them. So you think about it, the number of Middle East countries virtually own various
Vibhuti Ji, I think we need to go to the question answers now.
Let's do that.
We will discuss your questions while we are taking the audience questions.
Yes.
Okay, so Krishna Bhargav, David Wood, sir, do you think the world enjoys Abrahamic privilege? Do the non-Abrahamic faiths have a default disadvantage? What is your take on this subject?
So I guess the meaning there is that the so-called Abrahamic religions are the religions that somehow trace something back to Abraham. So this would be Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all claim Abraham. And so the idea here is there an advantage? Is there a kind of a advantage to this? Because you have a lot of power that Christians have, and then you have the Muslim world, and dozens of Muslim majority countries, and then you have Israel. And so the question is there some sort of default disadvantage among non-Abrahamic faiths? I think that's the idea there. And I would say it kind of depends on the situation and the location. So that obviously wouldn't be the case in in India, but you can look at it both ways, because very common to criticize Christianity here in the US, becoming increasingly common in the US to criticize Islam. And so you don't have a lot of criticism of Hinduism, right? People aren't thinking about it. And so I think you can think of it as an advantage or a disadvantage, in the sense that because there are Abrahamic faiths that are much more prominent in Western nations, or let's say in the Muslim world, that other other religions are not viewed as a threat, right? So Hinduism, Buddhism aren't thought of as threats to people in the West, and so they're not. People aren't usually criticizing them as much as they'd worry about, again, the so-called Abrahamic faiths. So you could look at it. You could look at it either way. You could say there are advantages and disadvantages.
Next.
Lull Extract. TikTok time to say thanks for uncovering the truth about Islam. Really enjoyed your content. Islamize Me was too good. Since many videos are eaten by sheep, hope you will do them again as promised.
Yep.
What is this, eaten by sheep?
Yeah. People who yeah, people who don't follow my channel they probably wouldn't know a lot about what this is talking about. I say TikTok time to rock when I'm live streaming, and then Islamicize Me was a series that we made about 3 guys who convert to Islam for 30 days to see what it does. And then videos eaten by sheep. That's because I deleted my content saying that I'm going to start over again. And yeah, people they remember a lot of like classic videos like 3 Stages of Jihad and so on that were from like 10 or 12 years ago. And I mentioned that I'd like to just remake these videos because I can do a much better job than back then. I had like a horrible camera. I wasn't using any sort of mic. And so I just know a lot more about making videos now than I did back then. So they're talking about me remaking these.
Yeah, you have an outstanding followers in the chat room. People are delighted that you have joined us today. Thank you.
Yes. Jack Kumar says, big fan, David.
Smart guy.
And okay. David Broden, Jaipur Dialogues. What a pleasant surprise. Hope to see you on ex-Muslim Sahil's channel as well. Okay, so that's a wish. Next. A human being, David sir, please do a video with Adam Seeker. Another wish. J. Templeton. A way to tackle is criticize Islam as much as possible, institutionalize protection of the ones who criticize Islam, set up harsh punishment on defensive jihad, might as well any jihad. Yeah, David.
Yeah, I mean, the Jay's right here that critics of Islam need to be protected. And, you know, with someone like Nupur Sharma, it's a situation where I don't understand enough about politics to know whether a political party should be basically saying that she can continue to do this. In other words, I understand that she's the spokesperson of a political party. And if that political party decides, hey, even though she should have the right to say things, she might not be able to associate with us in this situation, because that makes sense, right? I mean, you could have a company like Coca-Cola or something like this, and if someone from Coca-Cola started speaking about Islam, I could understand the company saying, hey, we don't want this to reflect what we're doing. So I understand organizations or political parties or whatever saying, hey, we don't want this associated with us right now, and therefore someone who's representing us, we don't want saying these kinds of things. But as far as just people being allowed to criticize Islam, yes, these people need to be protected. And it has to be understood that if you're criticizing Islam and they are threatening you, that the rest of the world is going to rally around you to protect you. And so, I mean, I would think that even institutions and political parties should get to a point where it's perfectly acceptable to criticize Islam, and that whenever people object to it and say, wait a minute, you can't say that about Muhammad, the response should be, oh, okay, well, we'll tell you what, this is how I would respond. If I were a political party and some spokesperson had said something critical about Islam, and then Muslims started challenging it, I would say, hey, you know what? I understand why you're concerned that this person is criticizing Islam. I tell you what we'll do. We'll get this person here, and you can bring someone from your side, and then you can get scholars who agree with you, and we'll get some scholars who agree with us, and we'll open up the sources and we'll lay them out on stage. And if she was wrong for what she said, if she was making that up, then by golly, she needs to publicly apologize for lying about your prophet. But if she was absolutely correct, then what are you complaining about? What in the world are you complaining about? So yeah, and it's a situation where I don't think you're going to see, at least not right now, governments and so on really protecting critics of Islam, but regular people can, right? Notice when someone draws a cartoon about Muhammad, let's say someone makes a Muhammad cartoon, and other people say, we're gonna kill that person for a Muhammad cartoon. Well, if the rest of the world stands up, I'm not talking about politicians and journalists. They can do whatever they want. But if regular people say, you know what, you just threatened to kill this person for drawing a Muhammad cartoon, well, now a bunch of us are going to draw Muhammad cartoons. Well, you've just protected that person because you've sent a message to the community. Hey, threatening that person is not going to get what you want. In fact, it's going to lead to more of what you're trying to oppose here. And so, yeah, there's got to be more effort on protecting critics, especially protecting ex-Muslims, because they are targets. Critics of Islam, ex-Muslims, those are pretty high priority targets for being silenced. And so, yeah, there should be massive punishments for people who try to stop them.
All right.
Nikhil, when there is a doubt in the very existence of the prophet itself, as by Dan Gibson and CEDA International, then why does social media encourage the ideology that pushes us to a lifestyle which was never there?
Yeah, so there are people like Jay Smith and a lot of others. Robert Spencer questions the existence of Muhammad, at least the existence of the Muhammad that we read about in the Muslim sources. And so the foundations of Islam are actually much shakier than most people realize, in that when you go to history, you can't find much of anything early on about Muhammad, when this guy's supposedly going around conquering Arabia, and yet you look at history and no one mentions him. I mean, the few mentions that you do have at any point in that first, those first several decades are extremely vague, and they don't even fit the standard Muslim timeline. And so the real sources that you get start more than a century after the time of Muhammad, and the earliest source that they have as far as a detailed biographical source is Ibn Asaq. That was from more than a century after the time of Muhammad, and that's a source that Muslims say they don't trust because it contains too much embarrassing material about Muhammad, and it didn't use the appropriate methodology. So the sources that Muslims really rely on are sources like Sahih al-Bukhari, which was written 2 centuries after the time of Muhammad. So this is very late material, and the sorts of things you would expect to find from a guy who's going around conquering Arabia, you'd expect him to at least be important enough that people had heard of him. When people didn't even heard of them, they didn't hear of his city, they didn't know anything about this. And so the foundations are very shaky. Now, I've made it known because I've debated this topic, that I actually believe that the general overall timeline that's in the Muslim sources, and I believe Muhammad existed, and I believe in the overall general timeline. But even I have to acknowledge that it's pretty hard to defend, because the first thing you're looking for when you're trying to establish something from history is you're looking for early sources and what they say. And any of the early sources you'd be looking for was someone who's going around doing all these things that Muhammad supposedly did. You just don't find them, and so it's pretty tricky. But yeah.
Common sense, David. I'm your big fan. I didn't have enough words to thank you when you started bashing the fraud Zakir Naik around 10 years back. He was celebrated back then. I started to listen to you 10 years ago for hours.
Yeah, this actually ties into what I was saying about, you can think you won a short-term victory and you're actually losing in the long term. So you take someone like, let me look up what he's got right now. So you take someone like Zakir Naik, who, when I was getting started out, he was by far the most popular Muslim apologist in the world. He was supposedly someone who can't be refuted. And Muslims had painted this picture of him as if he's this champion debater who's defeated everyone, even though he had like 3 debates that I could ever even find anywhere. And so if you just go back 15 years ago, this is the guy, this is the top guy. And then we start making fun of the things he's lying about, exposing his deception. Zakir Naik, I'm on his YouTube channel right now. Anyone can see this to verify. But Zakir Naik's channel, he has 3.2 million subscribers. That is a huge, huge following. But I'm looking at his recent videos. So what he posted yesterday, 9,700 views. And just going through all his recent videos, 14,000, 10,000, 13,000, 14,000, 31,000 is the high point for any of his recent videos. Then it's 17,000, 17,000, 19,000, 16,000, and so on. So Zakir Naik has trouble getting to 30,000 views. But for, that would be great for other YouTube channels. But for someone who has 3 million subscribers, that is not a lot of views. For someone who is supposedly the best ever for defending Islam, people, having difficulty getting 14,000, 10,000, 13,000 views. When you have 3 million subscribers, what does that mean? It means that people aren't watching him anymore. It means that people who were watching him 5 years ago aren't watching him now. And so what happened? He's just been exposed. He's just been exposed too much to where when they say Zakir Naik said something, they realize it's just going to be refuted. And so over time, he's becoming an embarrassment to them now. He's just lied too much in the past to where now it's very easy to say, oh, you like Zakir Naik? Well, look at this, and that. In fact, there was a funny video that Nabil made years ago. It got a ton of views. But Nabil made a video called Zakir Naik 25 Lies in Under 5 Minutes. And Nabil just watched a 5-minute clip of Zakir Naik and found 25 errors in there, 25 errors in what he said in just speaking for 5 minutes. That's how sloppy he was. But for years, Zakir Naik he's speaking to audiences who weren't in a position to challenge what he was saying or to expose what he's saying. And all of a sudden we get to the internet age where now we can say, oh, look, he just lied. Oh, look, here's another lie. Oh, look, this guy has no clue what he's talking about. And it's allowed us to expose him. And you look at it and it's his popularity is crumbling, just like what's happening in Islam. So, yep.
I think Zakir Naik and Ilhan can compete with each other with reference to.
Yeah, they should team up. They should team up.
They should team up.
Yes, they look like a fine couple. Yes. Next question, please.
Adi Kumar. Hi, David. Since India has 14% of Muslims, and according to Pew Research, it will be 18% in 2050. How do you see future of India in next 100 years, considering current situation, which will increase, obviously? I mean, he's referring to population part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, India is one of the countries where the percentage of Muslims puts it in the defensive jihad category, meaning that anything that's viewed as persecution of Muslims or even criticism of Islam can result in physical violence. And so India's in that range, and a lot of Muslims like to point to Pew Research statistics about how Islam is growing. Islam's growth is primarily due to high birth rates. So you have one of the most common arguments for Islam is growing so rapidly it must be true, which is very, very strange sort of argument. There have been very rapidly spreading movements in history. The communism spread more rapidly than almost anything in history. That has nothing to do with whether it's true. You have to look at other things to see whether it's correct or not. But Muslims point to the rapid growth of Islam and say, you see, this shows that it's true. Well, no, that doesn't, because you can look at the reasons for Islam's rapid growth, primarily high birth rates, meaning that something to do with Islam's impact on women. Women tend to get married younger in Islam because they don't have a lot of other opportunities in life. And so they get married off younger. They start having kids. A man can have multiple wives and so have way more children. And so that's the main reason that Islam is spreading. But if you're talking about something by 2050 or 100 years, I just don't see Islam doing well in the long term. It's like, it look like everyone is starting to catch on? Doesn't it look like, you know, people in the West, even though you'll still be called Islamophobe and things like that, it looks like a lot of people are catching on in the United States. It looks like a lot of people are catching on in Europe. Looks like a lot of people are catching on in India. It looks like people are catching on to what Islam is actually doing. And so I find it very difficult to think that Islam is going to be thriving a century from now, just because, you know, Pew Research points out the birth rate growth of Islam is going to lead to certain things in 2050. That's not taking into account this avalanche that we're seeing.
Quite right. Actually, you make us very optimistic, but even I have always sounded this optimistic note. Jahangir Gotla, I think instead of funding radical teaching institutions that inspires jihad, government should provide conclaves for the growing ex-Muslims. Yes, we have discussed that, but that's not the topic for India alone. We are talking globally. Dhruva Mukhopadhyay, although I see us winning, but with Hindus facing targeted killing, how do we reverse it, sir? How do I do it without getting killed and reverse the scenario?
Yeah, it's a numbers thing, right? In Islam, and you can see the difference with Nupur Sharma versus certain things that happened, you know, in other countries, in that they looked at that situation and said, you know, because we have these, you know, financial agreements with India, talking about Muslim nations right now, because we have these agreements, we can put a lot of pressure on the government right now. And so they're looking for situations where they know that they can put a kind of pressure on people to silence them or to marginalize someone or to, you know, get someone to lose their position or something like that. But they don't do that when the situation has changed. Matter of fact, let me give you a real world example. So I don't remember when it was, 10 years or so ago, there was a cartoonist, so someone who draws cartoons, named Molly Norris here in the US. And in response to jihadis threatening to kill the South Park creators for having a cartoon about Muhammad, she said, let's have an everyone draw Muhammad cartoon day, right? So she said, let's everyone draw Muhammad. And she drew like a coffee cup and said, and the coffee cup is saying, I'm Muhammad. And so she was threatened with death, had to go into hiding. As far as I know, she's still in hiding because of that. But the day that she said was going to be an everyone draw Muhammad day, thousands of people drew Muhammad. Now notice, when it was one person saying, let's have a draw Muhammad day, it was easy to threaten her into silence. When the South Park creators were saying they were going to do it, it was very easy to threaten their company into silencing them and not allowing the criticism of Muhammad. When thousands of people suddenly drew Muhammad, there was nothing they could do about it. And so notice how many people died because of that original everyone draw Muhammad cartoon day. When thousands of people drew cartoons of Muhammad and posted them on the internet, how many people died? Zero. There was zero. There's none. As long as it's this group of cartoonists like Charlie Hebdo or this particular person or this critic, it's easy to target that one person and to threaten that person into silence or to make that person go into hiding or to get that person marginalized. Whenever a ton of people rise up, there's just nothing they can do about it. And so they have to move on. And so the biggest thing we can do to protect people, to protect Hindus, if we're talking about, you know, India, to protect any sort of critics, if we're talking about wherever, the biggest thing we can do is more and more people need to be doing this until it's impossible to stop. So if it hadn't just been Nupur Sharma, but had been, you know, 1,000 people all at once, all standing up, what do you do then? How do you silence that many people? And so the biggest thing that we can do to protect people from getting killed by jihadis is to make sure there are too many of us criticizing Islam to kill.
Well, that's happening because Nupur Sharma has somehow galvanized millions
Oh, yeah.
of Hindus to come out on the street. That's happening every day.
And it's something that's something that spread over here, because one of the problems is that things will happen in other parts of the world, and here we don't hear about them. Like Robert Spencer and I have talked about this. There are killings every single week where jihadis are killing people in places like Nigeria. We never hear about them. We don't hear about them. We don't talk about them over here. So one of the things the Nupur Sharma controversy did was we even heard about it over here, right? This was news over here. And then it was, oh, what did she say? Oh, she said something about Muhammad having sex with a 9-year-old. Oh, she did. Well, where's that coming from? And so, but even aside from the information that people learned about Islam, it's also the issue of people look at that and at what's going on and realizing, wait a minute, why is there this obsession with silencing critics of Islam? It's over there too. They're realizing this isn't just some random person or this random group who's trying to silence critics of Islam. People are realizing it's wherever Islam is. Wherever Islam is, it's trying to silence critics of Islam. And so it's something that is helping people wake up. Wait a minute, we don't want to live in a world where we're not allowed to criticize something that calls for our violent subjugation. We don't want to live in a world like that. And so people are catching on.
Devang Bhatt. David, big fan. Got to know you first through analysis of Kashmir files. My family is from there. Question: how can you, Sanjay ji, Greet Wilders, etc., synergize voices rather than siloed local efforts? We have the same goal,
Yeah, and I mean, really, you can. It's fine either way. What we're doing works either way. So the idea here is you have critics of Islam. You have critics of Islam all over the world now. And a lot of us sort of do things on our own, right? Like I make videos in front of my bookshelf, and that's what I do. It's not like some massive organized thing. And so looks like the suggestion there is, how can people coordinate our efforts more? And you can do things like that. You can have conferences or online conferences and so on. But yeah, I mean, it might be cool to think of ways where people can work together. Like, I mean, that's what we're doing right now. But I don't know. I think it works either way. In other words, if you have 10,000 people who are criticizing Islam independently, or 10,000 people criticizing Islam together, it is good to think of ways that you can work together. But I think Islam's in trouble either way.
As you rightly said, there is a strength in numbers.
Mm-hmm.
I think that matters. Yes, go ahead. Dilip Kumar. Greetings, David. Welcome. Nice to see you on Jaipur Dialogues. Always great to hear your thought besides Sanjay and Vibhuti. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Dilip. Bharat Bhushan. Hi, David. In India, the factories, madrasas of creating haters and blind followers is running with full swing. How, therefore, you see ex-Muslims movement slowing down Islam?
Well, because all you have to do is look at what's been happening over the past 10 years. The rate of apostasy has been accelerating rapidly. So if in 2006, 2007, 2008, it was still common to say that no one has ever left Islam. And now ex-Muslims are having these conferences and so on, and they're all over the internet, and there are tons of ex-Muslim channels on YouTube. It looks like they're accelerating. But yes, you have the madrasas, and you have them cranking out, jihadis and so on. But that gets more and more difficult as people are exposed to more and more information about Islam. In other words, a madrasa now has a much more difficult time keeping people insulated from hearing criticisms of Islam or from hearing factual information about Islam than they did 20 years ago. Much more difficult now. But it's going to become more and more difficult every single year. In other words, 2 years from now, it's going to be more difficult to keep these guys from hearing information about Muhammad and Aisha and all these other things. It's going to be more difficult as time goes on. And so it's a situation where I say, you madrasas can try as hard as you want, unless you move to Antarctica or something like that. These guys are going to eventually learn that you're filling their heads with complete nonsense. Not all of them, but it increases over time, right? So it's not like next year everyone's going to leave Islam or something. It's increasing.
Yes, the statistics here in India, they show that of the total number of students, only about 4% enroll into madrasas. So in spite of all the money that is flowing into it, only about 4% go into madrasas. Only trouble is that it is these madrasa educated people who control the mosques. So that is where the rub is. Next. AJ, in US, Christians in government and church are perpetuating caste-based hyperbole versus an inclusive Hindutva. Can we please educate David about caste and Hindutva, please? We'll do it some other time. Just today we are talking about Islam. Nakul Kote, have been a big fan of David Wood since 2015. However, I'm saddened to see him support people like Glory Apologetics in India, who are predatory in nature.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I'm still a Christian and a Christian apologist. So as long as people are being peaceful in doing apologetics is just giving a defense of what you believe. So everyone does this. Anyone who gives a defense of what you believe, that's what the word apologetics means. It comes from the Greek word apologion, which in the Greek world was a defense speech after the prosecution spoke. So the prosecution would get up to speak, and then the defense speech is called the apologia. And so that's where the word apologetics comes from. So as far as Christians doing apologetics, I'm going to be for Christians doing apologetics, as long as they're doing it peacefully, not spreading hate and so on.
Okay, Saurabh Kulkarni, David Bhai, how long till the jihad situation in US become like in France and UK?
I don't think it's ever going to become like it is in France. The numbers just aren't there. So you have a much more sizable Muslim minority in France than you do in the UK. I'm not sure exactly what the statistics are. I think it's around 10%. So that is a massively bigger percentage of the population than in the US, where it's around 1%. But if you look in the US, Islam isn't growing enough. Even taking immigration and birth rates into account, Islam isn't growing enough to ever change that. In other words, the number of Muslims are increasing, but and by the way, it's got to be through immigration and birth rates, because the number of converts to Islam in the US is offset by the number of people who are leaving Islam. So Islam isn't gaining any ground by converts in the West. And there's a statistic where over half of people who convert to Islam in the West leave Islam within 2 years. So it's not growing that way. And so I'm looking at it, unless something changes, it looks like Islam is always going to be 1% of the population unless it starts declining. It doesn't look like it's going to increase, because the number of people who are converting to Islam is offset by the number of people who are leaving Islam. You do have Muslim immigrants coming in, but that's not enough to change the percentage given the rate of growth of the country. In other words, even as you have more Muslims coming into the country, immigrating, the number of people in the whole country is growing, right? The number of people in the whole country is growing. And so everything basically offsets, and Islam stays around 1%. And so I don't see anything that could change that in the near future. And as long as it's 1% of the population, you're never going to be in the really, in the defensive jihad stage.
They're getting into politics a lot more. They're far more active in domestic politics now. for legislatures, to state legislatures, to council and other places to command a voice.
Mm-hmm.
Next question, please.
Oh, on that real quick, it's one more difficulty they're going to find there, which you're already seeing, is who do they team up with? Who do they pick? Right? And you've seen that over the past decade, they've tended to side with an extreme left wing of the political spectrum, and now that's already breaking down. And so it's weird, because who do you agree with? Do they side with conservatives? Do they side with leftists? Who are they going to form alliances with? There's no really good fit for anything that would truly, be Islamic. You can't side with the far left because you have too many disagreements with them on moral issues. You can't side with the right because they're going to be pretty hardcore defenders of people's right to speak and criticize Islam. And so there doesn't seem to be a good political fit as far as forming alliances.
They found the fit with Bernie Sanders and the gang.
Yeah, good luck with that one.
Vishal Kothari. David, do you think Saudi king is sincere with his efforts to reform Islam? Why would they want to de-radicalize or reform when the same people earn them billions of dollars of revenue each year via religious tourism?
Well, this is connected to what I was saying a little bit ago, and that I think that governments are going to have to change as they realize it's similar to the situation in India. India has relationships with countries around the world, and they can be, important business relationships and so on. And so if something's going to interfere with that, you have to take that into consideration. Do we want this to jeopardize these other relationships? Well, it's not just politicians in India or the United States who think that way. Muslim leaders have to think like that too. If you're Saudi Arabia, if your country's in the Muslim world, unless you want to be just completely on your own, which no one does, you rely right now on a global network of nations. So people like the Saudi king is realizing, hey, if we're having public beheadings and lashings all the time, this is going to hurt us long term. And so you basically have two reactions. And this goes back after you saw this a lot after World War I. So up until World War I, you still had a caliphate. And then it loses. And then it becomes clear that Western nations are much more powerful than the Muslim world. And there were two possible reactions to that. It was, one, we can either learn to get along with the rest of the world. So Islam clearly can't function the way it has historically. So we have to adapt to the modern world. That's one direction you could go. And you saw that in places like Pakistan, where Afghanistan actually, but Pakistan too, where 50 years ago they started dressing in a Western style and so on. You saw this in Iran, and if you took a picture of people in Iran 40 years ago, you wouldn't notice the difference between that and a place in Europe. And because that's one possible reaction. Hey, we need to modernize and be part of the modern world. But you have the sort of reverse reaction, which is, wait a minute. Why are Western nations more powerful than us? Why are we being overpowered in different parts of the world, and other people are turning out to be stronger than us when we're supposed to actually be the ones who go out and subjugate the world according to Allah? Allah promised us victory. Muhammad promised us victory. Why is everyone else more powerful than us? And so the reaction there can be, it's because we haven't been faithful enough. And so we have to crack down even more. We have to enforce Sharia even more, because Allah is not going to bless us unless we are completely faithful. And that was the attitude of groups like ISIS and so on, and the Muslim Brotherhood leading up to that. It's that we have to crack down more and impose Sharia more, and we have to get more violent and carry out these penalties even more. That's the other possible reaction. And so I think what you're seeing from the king of Saudi Arabia is he's catching on that we have to be thinking about our relationship with the rest of the world. And so yeah, I think you're going to be seeing that a lot. And so it doesn't mean that his intentions are good, right? It doesn't mean, hey, I decided that these teachings of Islam are bad and I want to modernize them. It can be just practical. It's just, hey, this is not in our best interest right now. It's in our best interest for everyone to think that Islam doesn't teach these things. And so I don't know what's in his heart, but either way, yeah, I'd be great. I'd be very happy to see him get rid of some of this stuff.
Okay, the last question of the day, Mithilesh Kumar. Some non-profits in US are collecting funds to do Qurbani on behalf of the donor in Pakistan, India, and Kashmir. Can these funds land into wrong hands?
Any fundraisers can always end up in the wrong hands. Yeah, unless you really know, unless you really know the person and know that this person is trustworthy. Things like that have happened a lot. So yeah. It's going to depend on the group. Always look into the group that's doing the fundraising.
Okay, with that, we come to the end of the session. Thank you, all viewers, and thank you, David, so much. Wonderful having you on Jaipur Dialogues, and we hope to have more interactions in the future. And thank you, Vibhuti Ji, as always.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. David, thank you very much. It was a pleasure meeting you
today. Good night from India.
No problem. You guys too.